As we take a further look at complex structure, we find that there's an independent clause and a dependent clause. So we're again looking for a subject and verb in each of those. This time the subordinating conjunction is attached to the dependent clause, sometimes known as the subordinate clause. So we have a subordinate conjunction hooking to the subordinate clause. I've listed just a few. There are many more. You can refer to another video on this to see a more extensive list. Here's an example. We turned the volume louder as the cement truck drove past us. Here we have the as the subordinate conjunction. As soon as you find the subordinating conjunction, you have found the beginning of the dependent clause. So this chunk to the end of the sentence is the dependent clause. It has a subject and verb in it, but it doesn't make sense by itself. As the cement truck drove past us, yeah, what? Cement truck or truck, actually we have a subject and a verb because it was the truck that drove. The cement truck tells us what kind of, the cement tells us what kind of truck it is. So technically that's an adjective. More on that in the adjective section. Truck drove in the dependent clause, which means that this has to be the independent clause. Let's find its subject and verb. We turned the volume louder. We, it's a pronoun that functions as a subject. Turned, you can turn. We turned. So we have, we turned the volume louder. Oh, I see. And then the dependent clause explains to us why we had to, because the cement truck drove by. A noisy thing. Okay, so we have an independent clause here, and the dependent clause is second. It doesn't always have to be that way, though. It's possible to flip the clauses and put the dependent clause first. So all of this could come off and go in the first position. So we actually would start the sentence with the subordinating conjunction, which begins that dependent clause. And then the independent clause would come last in the sentence. You could flip this right around. As the cement truck drove past us, we turned the volume louder. How about a different example? In this sentence, we have, if Jack cleans his room, he will get his allowance. I began the sentence with if, which is a subordinate conjunction. As soon as you find the subordinate conjunction, you know you have the beginning of the dependent clause. The dependent clause needs a subject and verb. If Jack cleans, here we have Jack as the subject, and what's he doing? Cleans. If Jack cleans his room, he will get his allowance. As we're reading through, we need to find the subject and verb of the independent clause. And as soon as we hit it, right here, he will get. With subject is the pronoun he, will get. As soon as we find the other subject and verb, we know that that begins the next clause, in this case, the independent clause. So the dependent clause must stop here. Now we can read it as, if Jack cleans his room, he will get his allowance. Right between the clauses now, we need a punctuation mark. You can even hear it as I read the sentence, the brief pause. If Jack cleans his room, he will get his allowance. So we need to have a comma between the clauses. This signifies that the dependent clause is ending right there, and the independent clause is beginning. Why do you need that comma? In the syntax of the English language, the pattern, the normal pattern, is to have the independent clause first, the clause that makes sense and could stand alone. That's usually how we speak. Putting the condition or the consequence of his lack of cleaning his room last. So it would be, he will get his allowance, or you might say Jack instead of he. Jack will get his allowance if he cleans his room. There's kind of a conditional idea going on here. Jack just doesn't get the money. He's got to clean his room first. And usually that's expressed with an independent clause first. Jack will get his allowance, and here comes the condition, if he cleans his room. But it's possible to switch the clauses. If Jack cleans his room, he will get his allowance. When that happens, the dependent clause needs to be singled out here so the reader knows that this is the result, or this is the condition that is set up for him to get his allowance. So that's a brief explanation of why that sentence structure needs a comma, but actually flipped complex sentences are very interesting if they're not used exclusively. If they're used all the time, it tends to sound like a legal document. But the dependent clause coming first in a complex sentence adds variety to your writing and interest, and teachers really love that.